I mean, let's just start broad. That just the story idea generally. Like, people look at him as this sort of radical figure who wants to overhaul the government.
Mm-hmm.
Did he govern like that as mayor?
No. He was a pragmatist. The first thing he had to do was he had to get control of the government because the government was a weak mayor form of government. So just because he was elected didn't mean he held all the power. He didn't have the legislative branch, which was hostile to him. He didn't even have the administrative agencies, which were appointed by the commissions and not by him. So he was working with enemies and had to. His first struggle and his first triumph was to overcome that resistance, and he did that by continuing organizing, by setting up extra parliamentary groups, task forces, councils, things that you could do through executive action, right? And he worked with community groups. Once he had established himself with a majority and the most vociferous opposition had stepped aside or been eliminated, then he could begin to bring forward proposals. And from that point, from 82, 83 onward, there was a whole series of many proposals. It was almost like a fire hose of proposals, also somewhat similar to Trump, but, progressive. Every week or two, there was something new coming out of City Hall, a new office. He also established the Community and Economic Development Office, which was established in a way to take the power to some extent away from the Planning Commission, which was hostile to him, which was a commission that was sort of controlled by the old guard. And so he was good at also establishing these new entities, the Arts Office, the Youth Office, the Women's Office, and especially CEDO, the Housing Trust. All of these institutions and bodies were formed during the 80s. Each one is a very small piece. They're not radical revolutionary, they're incremental, but they are substantive reforms. They don't challenge capitalism, but they mitigate its impacts and they deliver to very specific constituencies.
So how did they mitigate the impacts?
Well, because because when you have better housing code enforcement, you limit the impact of landlords being able to get really gouge and take advantage of residents. Just the fact that you modernize and use the resources better, that you streamline, you coordinate, improves things. More transparency. When one of the things Bernie says often is that he feels his greatest accomplishment was the increase in participation in the city, which is a more general notion, but it is important because not only in terms of votes, but people turning out for events, people turning out for meetings, people putting forward initiatives, much more activity. There was a whole set of proposals and groups reforming, given license and encouragement to do so by his presence and by his leadership. So a certain kind of political moral leadership combined with tactical decisions to establish certain groups that either within the system or outside the system will add on or challenge the status quo. Hiring competent people, younger people, generational change, that was also part of the mix. Because he was coming in after administration that was older people who'd been in power a long time, and he was 39, but he brought in people even younger than him. So you have all of that going on. Let me think, and then being willing to rethink some of he didn't deliver on everything, like on waterfront and some of these road projects. He reconsidered his position on them because they weren't necessarily fundamental beliefs. They were more like tactical electoral decisions. Mm-hmm. And so, when new information came in, he shifted ground.
When you say, really quick, waterfront, that's the part when it was like the first proposal was the mix of private-public and then
right.
It wasn't being voted on, or what?
Well, okay, so he ran on Burlington is not for sale, and one of the main focuses was the waterfront because there was a plan to build condos right near the water's edge. There wouldn't have been very many public amenities. It was being pushed by big developers who he could identify with, in a sense, the millionaire class. And when he came in, he said, he's going to redo it. But after a couple of years, he realized that it was difficult to assemble the capital, and these Canadian developers came to him with a proposal, and and he thought it was better because it did have more public space, but it was negotiated secretly behind closed doors, which was, again, a violation of, in a way, of his transparency pledge. And it was also still going to bring hotel and condos close to the water's edge. And at that point, a combination of Democrats and environmentalists, dissident Democrats who were not conservative, people like Howard Dean, who was just coming up locally then, and environmentalists and Greens who were more, about preserving and not developing the waterfront, joined forces to oppose this first plan. And they had to get bond vote approval for the public financing, and they could not get sufficient support for that.
And bond vote was 60?
Well, you had to have 2/3, and he couldn't get. Okay. Yeah, he got a majority, but he couldn't get 2/3. So they had to go back to the drawing board, and a combination of some of these liberal Democrat lawyer types and John Franco, who was part of Bernie's ally, came up with this idea of pushing what was called the public trust doctrine, which is the notion of argument, basically a legal argument, that if land is sort of undeveloped by its owners, the railroad, that it would revert to public control. And they were able to assert and win a case on this, and so they were able to build, say, the boathouse, which you probably saw, which was, in a sense, one of the first things that was built down there.
Is the boathouse? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Just totally.
No, of course.
I didn't walk all the way out to it.
Yeah.
It looks like there's a restaurant there.
Yeah, there is.
But that's still considered public because, anyone can go.
Well, it's a concession. It's a contract. It's a publicly owned building with a concession in it.
Got it.
The concessions changed over time. Okay. It's also available. I got married there.
Oh.
You can rent it, and hold a thing. It'll hold about 100 people, second floor.
Okay. Sorry, keep going.
It's okay. But anyway, that set the tone, for development, and then they were able to bring in some commercial development and, stores, and not everybody's satisfied, but it's certainly, much better than it would have been. And that's happened a couple of times in Burlington, where the first offer is not a really good offer. The public rejects it, and then the second offer, you get a better iteration and concessions are made. We're going through that process right now in Burlington downtown. If you walk up Church Street on the third block, there's this, it says, what is it called? Marketplace Center or something like that. You go in the big doors into a mall. It's really awful in there now. It was good for a while. This is a history of this area. It goes back 60, 70 years. It was an Italian neighborhood, which in the 50s was just eliminated because of urban blight. It was a low-income neighborhood. And then it was vacant for years, and it was an urban renewal. It was going to be where they built the urban. So eventually, after churches burned and all sorts of suspicious stuff, they finally built a mall, But they were on the tail end of this kind of mall development sort of curve. And the whole idea of anchor stores and the size of the market, it never quite worked. And then it kind of just shriveled up. And when the new Democrats came back into power in the city 7, 8 years ago, they said, we're going to just redo that.
New Democrats as in sort of the business.
Mayor Weinberger, now the Democratic administration controls the city, and the progressives are not in control of the mayor's office anymore. So many of these proposals that have been on the shelf have been brought back out, and one of them is to redevelop again this same downtown place.
Okay.
And so they got the public to approve $20-something million for infrastructure improvements to help make this happen. But the guy can't deliver, and it's just a big hole in the ground right now. And everybody's very upset. And, they keep saying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. But, this hole in the ground has been there for several years now, and it's been there before. It's this place that just keeps, sucking in resources and is based on a concept of commercial development that the business community somehow thinks is going to work here, but never quite has.
Interesting.
Because it's just not that big a place. At 40,000 people, there's people come down from Montreal and maybe over from Plattsburgh, but it's not that big a magnet. You can't build hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new square footage of commercial space. They want to put a 14-story building up in the middle of downtown. Imagine what that would be like, and the trouble that you would have to keep it occupied.
Right.
It's It's gentrification, our style. And so Bernie's presence in Burlington prevented those things from happening. It mitigated a lot of effects. Getting back to your point, having a responsible, socially responsible, not socialist, but a socially responsible administration that was willing to balance the needs of capitalism with the needs of the community to deliver on exactly what he says. He did what he said he did. He's not... He runs as a revolutionary. He governs as a reformer, as a progressive reformer. That's what makes him a pragmatic populist. He has aspirations which are popular aspirations for a more equal and fair society. Fair is a big word for Bernie. And the idea that people should pay their fair share, a very fundamental notion, which is threatening to a lot of people because underneath that very simple notion is a much more complex notion, which is redistribution of wealth. And that's where we lose the Wall Street Journal.
Our reader is not coming to that.
But, I get that, but I'm just trying to explain it in a way that is demystifying. And I think that Bernie is not, I don't know that he's really an educational politician because he repeats the same thing over and over again. And in a way that's good because people that's how you learn certain lessons, But on the other hand, sometimes I feel like he should go deeper, and he doesn't use the word redistribution. But it does underlie a lot of what he's talking about. But that's a very threatening word to people. Even though if you laid out the argument, if you said, well, 3 people have this and 90% have that, there's something wrong with that.
People, yeah.
Yeah, but just, oftentimes when I studied the First Amendment, I got a fellowship years back, and I was talking about, I wanted to sort of do some kind of like reform of the First Amendment because I don't believe in absolute rights. I believe the First Amendment is precious, but time, place, and manner restrictions. And the guy said to me, well, it's a slippery slope. If you start this, you don't know who decides what the limit is. And that's what people are scared about. They're scared that, what's the difference between a little bit of socialism and a police state? We kind of have a police state now, but it's a corporate police state, I mean, we are living through what Bertrand Gross 40 years ago described as friendly fascism. Make no mistake about it. That's what is existing right now in this country. I know people are very upset about the use of that word and don't like it thrown at individuals. I get that. But if you look at objectively what the ideology means and what is occurring, they're the same. And Bernie isn't using that word that much. He uses it a little bit. But he's going more, I think the coalition he's trying to build is a coalition of young people, African-American supporters. I think he's doing better there than he did the last time, and he's making it a high priority. And I think he really would like to have the heartland working class, but Biden right now is trying to block his entry. Yeah. And we'll see what happens with that. That's the question.
His team seems to say they think Biden is more of a threat to him than Warren because of working class voters. Yeah. Not necessarily a threat, but they think they're competing for the same pool in a way they don't think they're competing with Warren, which our polling shows differently.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't follow
different pockets.
Yeah, but I thought so. Biden, people say Biden started with race, but I think he started with unions. His first speeches, even before he announced his candidacy, were almost all to union groups.
Right. Oh, yeah,
that's where he wanted to start his base, and that's something that is very important to Bernie. And if he were the nominee, he would do a lot. He would really bend over backwards to rebuild and extend his appeal to the unions of America.
So talk to me about when he was mayor. The times where it was conflicting with his support for unions or workers with environment or anti-war or sort of the...
Well, it was mainly the peace movement. I think that's the most... That is the most clear-cut case of it.
Okay.
He always was a little bit skeptical of environmentalists. He's much more supportive of the environmental movement, and he's very outspoken on climate change. When he was mayor, he he kind of thought about environmentalists the same way he thought about the peace movement: good intentions, but perhaps naive and a little